The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight, and Alara Chen had long since stopped expecting it to let up. It hammered against the diner's plate glass windows in relentless sheets, turning the coastal highway outside into a blur of red taillights and fractured neon. The storm had driven away what little business the Seabreeze diner usually saw on a Thursday night, leaving her alone with the hum of the ancient refrigerator and the smell of burnt coffee that no amount of scrubbing could eliminate from the air. She didn't mind the quiet. Quiet meant safety. Quiet meant invisible. Alara moved behind the counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself small, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, refilling salt shakers that didn't need refilling. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, a few escaped strands clinging to her temples. She wore no makeup, hadn't in 3 years. The woman who used to sit at vanity tables in penthouses overlooking the city, who used to wear silk and diamonds, and the weight of a powerful man's obsession, had been carefully erased. That woman was dangerous to remember. In the back office, just beyond the swinging kitchen door, her son was sleeping on the worn leather couch she'd covered with blankets to make it softer. Leo, 3 years old, with his father's stubborn chin and his mother's delicate features and eyes the color of molten silver that she saw every time she looked at him and felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. He was worth it. Worth the running, the hiding, the endless string of false names and towns where no one asked questions. Worth every sleepless night, wondering if she'd been found. The bell above the door chimed. Alara's head snapped up, her pulse immediately jumping. No one came to the diner this late, especially not in weather like this. Her hand tightened on the dish rag as she turned toward the entrance, and for a moment, her mind went completely blank, because the man stepping through the doorway wasn't just anyone. He was the reckoning she'd been running from for 3 years. Dante Volkov moved like a predator entering unfamiliar territory, slowly, with absolute confidence, his dark eyes sweeping the space with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. Water ran from the shoulders of his black overcoat, expensive fabric that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. Beneath it, he wore a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it might as well have been armor. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from the rain, but somehow that only made him more devastating, softening nothing about the brutal beauty of his face. He was taller than she remembered, broader. Or maybe she'd just forgotten what it felt like to be in the same room with someone who radiated that much raw, unapologetic power. The scent hit her a moment later. Ozone and expensive cedarwood cologne, the kind that lingered on skin and sheets and memories she'd tried desperately to bury. Her stomach twisted with something she refused to name. Fear, maybe. Or worse, recognition. The treacherous cellular memory of a body that had once known his touch like a language. Dante's gaze found her behind the counter, and the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. His eyes were exactly as she remembered, cold, penetrating silver that could strip a person down to their secrets. For 3 heartbeats, neither of them moved. The rain continued its assault on the windows. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Then he walked toward her. Each step was measured, deliberate, the sound of his Italian leather shoes against the cracked linoleum like a countdown. Alara's fingers went numb. She wanted to run, to scream, to grab Leo and disappear into the storm, but her body had turned to stone. All she could do was watch as Dante Volkov, the man she'd married and divorced and fled from, closed the distance between them with the inevitability of a guillotine blade. He stopped on the other side of the counter. Up close, she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. He looked tired, dangerous, and utterly terrifyingly focused. Alara. Her name in his voice was a complete sentence, not a question, not a greeting, a statement of ownership. She forced herself to breathe. You shouldn't be here. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, maybe? Or respect? It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You've been running for 3 years?" His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low, dark, with that faint accent that only emerged on certain words, a remnant of his Russian father and Italian mother. "Did you really think I wouldn't find you?" Of course she'd known. Deep down, in the part of her that had loved him and feared him in equal measure, she'd always known this day would come. Dante Volkov didn't lose things. He collected them, controlled them, kept them in the palm of his hand until he decided otherwise. But she'd had to try. For Leo, she'd had to try. "The divorce was finalized," she said quietly. "You signed the papers yourself. I don't belong to you anymore." Something dangerous shifted in his eyes. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the counter between them, and suddenly the barrier seemed meaningless. He was too close, his presence overwhelming, filling her lungs with that damned cedarwood scent until she couldn't think straight. "You think a piece of paper changes what you are to me?" His voice had dropped to a near whisper, but it carried more threat than any shout. "I let you go, Alara. I chose to sign those papers because the war I was fighting would have destroyed you. Don't mistake my protection for abandonment." Her throat tightened. She'd spent 3 years telling herself that he'd cast her aside, that the divorce had been proof he'd never truly wanted her. It had been easier that way, easier to run from a man who didn't care than from one who'd pushed her away to keep her safe. But the fury in his eyes right now wasn't the fury of an indifferent man. "Why now?" she asked. "The war is over. I read about it. Mikhail Koslov is dead. You won. So, why track me down now?" Dante's jaw tightened. "Because I've spent 3 years cleaning the blood off my empire and making it safe. Because every man who wanted to hurt me by hurting you is either dead or too terrified to speak my name. Because you've hidden long enough. I'm not coming back." The words felt like swallowing glass, but she forced them out. "I have a life here, a simple life. I don't want your world anymore, Dante. I never did." He straightened slowly, and she saw his gaze sweep over her. The cheap diner uniform, the exhaustion in her face, the hands that were raw from hours of washing dishes and wiping tables. She watched something dark and possessive move through his expression, something that made her skin prickle with awareness. "This is what you wanted?" His voice was soft, deadly. "Working yourself to the bone in a place that smells like grease and desperation? Living in whatever shit apartment you can afford on a waitress salary? You traded silk for polyester and called it freedom?" Anger flared in her chest, hot and welcome because it burned away the fear. "I traded your cage for my own choices. That's worth more than all the silk in the world." For a moment, she thought he might reach across the counter and grab her. She could see the restraint in the rigid set of his shoulders, the tension in his hands. Dante Volkov was a man who took what he wanted, and she was dangerously close to making him remember just how much he'd wanted her. But then a sound broke the standoff between them. A small, sleepy voice calling from the back office. "Mama." Alara's blood turned to ice. She saw the exact moment Dante registered the word. His entire body went still, his eyes sharpening with predatory focus. When he looked at her again, there was something new in his expression, something calculating, and absolutely merciless. "Mama," he repeated softly. Before she could move, before she could think of a lie or a distraction or anything, the kitchen door swung open. Leo stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes with one small fist. He was wearing his favorite dinosaur pajamas, the ones that were getting too small but that he refused to give up. His dark hair was mussed from sleep, sticking up in all directions, and his eyes, those unmistakable silver eyes, were drowsy and confused as he looked around the empty diner. Alara's world stopped spinning. She watched Dante's gaze lock onto her son, watched those razor-sharp eyes trace every detail of Leo's face, the shape of his nose, the stubborn set of his jaw, the impossible silver of his irises. She saw the moment. Comprehension hit him, saw his expression shift from confusion to shock, to something vast and terrible and utterly unreadable. Leo, oblivious to the man who had just discovered his existence, padded across the floor toward her. "Mama, when are we going home? I'm hungry." "Soon, baby," Alara managed, her voice strangled. "Just give Mama a few more minutes, okay?" But Dante was already moving. He rounded the counter in 3 strides, his coat billowing behind him like something out of a nightmare. Alara's instinct was to step between him and Leo, to shield her son from this dangerous man, but Dante was faster. He was always faster. He stopped in front of Leo, towering over the small boy, and then, slowly, carefully, he crouched down until they were eye level. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to grab Leo and run, but her legs wouldn't move. All she could do was watch as the most dangerous man she'd ever known came face to face with the child he'd never known existed. Leo, for his part, stared at Dante with open curiosity. "Who are you?" Dante's hand lifted, and Alara stopped breathing. But he only rested it on Leo's shoulder, a large, powerful hand that could break bones or sign death warrants, now touching her son with something almost like reverence. "Silver eyes," Dante murmured, as if to himself. "Like Mercury." Leo giggled. "That's what Mama says." Dante's gaze flicked up to Alara, and what she saw there made her knees weak. Fury, betrayal, possession. And beneath it all, something raw and wounded that she'd never seen in him before. He stood slowly, his hand still on Leo's shoulder, keeping the boy close. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet, so laced with leashed violence, that it took everything in her not to flinch. "How old is he?" She couldn't lie. Not about this. 3. 3. He repeated the word like a curse. 3 years, Alara. 3 years you've kept my son from me." "You didn't want me," she whispered. "The divorce was to protect you from a war that would have put a target on your back." His voice was rising now, the careful control fracturing. "I spent 3 years turning this city into a fortress so you could come home safely. 3 years building an empire that could keep you and... He looked down at Leo again, something breaking in his expression. "What's his name?" "Leo." Her voice was barely audible. "Leonardo." Dante's eyes closed for just a moment, and when they opened again, they were absolutely arctic. He lifted his gaze to her, and Alara felt the full weight of his rage and his power and his absolute, unwavering certainty. "You have 5 seconds to explain why my son is in a place like this." "Alara." Each word was carefully enunciated, deadly calm. "And then, we're leaving." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The rain continued to fall, and Alara stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the man who had just reclaimed everything she'd spent 3 years running from, knowing with absolute clarity that her life of hiding was officially over. Alara had exactly 90 seconds to gather their lives before Dante made the decision for her. She moved through the back office in a blur, shoving Leo's few toys into her worn canvas bag. The stuffed elephant with one missing ear, the set of wooden blocks she'd found at a thrift store, the picture book they read every night before bed. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the zipper. Behind her she could hear Dante's voice, low and calm, speaking to someone on his phone in rapid Russian. She caught fragments, coordinates, the address, something about a full security sweep. He was calling in his people, already tightening the net. "Mama, where are we going?" Leo was fully awake now, his silver eyes bright with confusion as she stuffed his small feet into his rain boots. "On an adventure, baby." The lie tasted like ash, but she forced a smile. "We're going to see a big house." Will there be dinosaurs? Maybe. She pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo, trying to memorize this moment, the last moment before everything changed. But you need to be very good, okay? Very quiet and good. Leo nodded solemnly, the way he always did when he sensed her fear. When she emerged from the office with Leo's hand in hers and the bag slung over her shoulder, Dante was waiting by the door. He'd ended his call, and now he stood with his hands in the pockets of his coat, watching her with an expression that gave away nothing. But she could see the tension in his jaw, the dangerous stillness that always preceded violence. "The car is outside," he said simply. "I need to lock up the diner. My boss is being contacted as we speak. You're not coming back here, Alara. Accept that now." The finality in his voice made her want to scream. 3 years she'd built this life, humble as it was. 3 years of safety and anonymity, and the freedom to make her own choices. And he was dismantling it in minutes, with the same ruthless efficiency he'd used to dismantle his enemies. "I don't have a choice, do I?" Something flickered in his eyes. "You stopped having a choice the moment you kept my son from me." The words were a knife between her ribs, precise and brutal. Because he was right. She'd made this inevitable the day she'd fled with their child, the day she'd decided that protecting Leo from Dante's world mattered more than anything, even the truth. She wanted to argue, to fight, to demand he'd let them stay. But Leo was watching, his small hand squeezing hers, and she couldn't let him see her fall apart. So she nodded, and she followed Dante Volkov into the storm. The car waiting outside was exactly what she'd expected. A black Mercedes S-Class with windows tinted dark enough to be illegal in most states. Rain hammered against its pristine surface as Dante opened the rear door, and Alara caught a glimpse of cream leather interior and ambient lighting the color of ice. "Get in." It wasn't a request. Alara lifted Leo into the car seat that was already installed, perfectly sized for a 3-year-old, as if Dante had known, had prepared. And her stomach twisted with the realization that he'd planned this. How long had he been watching them? How much had he seen? Leo settled into the seat with wide eyes, his fingers trailing over the leather. "Mama, this car is fancy." "I know, baby." She buckled him in with trembling hands, then slid in beside him. Dante rounded the vehicle and folded himself into the seat on Leo's other side. The door closed with a heavy final sound that reminded her of a vault ceiling. The driver, a massive man with a shaved head and the unmistakable bearing of military training, didn't even glance back as he pulled onto the rain-slicked highway. The silence in the car was suffocating. Alara kept her eyes on the window, watching the coastal town disappear into darkness and rain. Somewhere out there was the small apartment over the bookstore, where they'd been living. The neighbor who sometimes watched Leo when Alara had double shifts. The coffee shop owner who always slipped Leo a cookie when he thought Alara wasn't looking. Her life. Gone. "There's water in the console." Dante's voice cut through her thoughts. "And food, if the boy is hungry." She glanced at the center console and found bottles of expensive sparkling water and a carefully arranged container of fresh fruit and crackers. Of course, Dante thought of everything. "Leo, are you hungry?" she asked softly. Her son shook his head, too overwhelmed by the luxury surrounding him to think about food. His gaze had fixed on Dante, studying the severe profile of the man beside him with unabashed curiosity. "You're very tall," Leo announced. Alara's breath caught. But Dante turned his head slowly, looking down at the child with an expression she couldn't read. "I am." "Are you a giant?" "No." "Do you know any giants?" The corner of Dante's mouth twitched, the ghost of something that might have been amusement in another man. "I've known men who thought they were giants. They were wrong." Leo considered this with the seriousness only a 3-year-old could muster. Then he held up his stuffed elephant, the one with the missing ear. "This is Mr. Trumpets. He's very brave." Dante stared at the worn toy for a long moment. Alara watched him, her heart in her throat, waiting to see how this man who commanded empires and ended lives would respond to her son's innocent offering. "He looks formidable," Dante said finally, his voice careful. "He lost his ear fighting a dragon." Leo's tone suggested this was common knowledge. "A honorable wound. Do you have any scars from fighting dragons?" Alara should intervene, should redirect the conversation, but she was frozen, watching this surreal interaction unfold. Dante's hand lifted and she tensed, but he only loosened his tie with deliberate slowness before unbuttoning the top of his shirt. The scar was visible even in the ambient lighting. A long puckered line that ran from his collarbone down beneath the fabric. Alara remembered when he'd gotten it, remembered the night she'd found him bleeding in their penthouse, surrounded by bodies and the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Not a dragon," Dante said quietly, "but something just as dangerous." Leo's eyes went wide. "Did it hurt?" "Yes." "Did you cry?" "No." "Mama says it's okay to cry when you're hurt." Dante's gaze flicked to Alara, and for just a moment she saw something vulnerable in those silver eyes. "Your mother is right. But sometimes men like me forget how." The honesty of the statement stole her breath. This was the Dante she'd fallen in love with, the one who existed beneath the layers of violence and control, the one who only emerged in darkness and quiet moments. She'd thought that man was lost, buried under 3 years of war and blood. But maybe he'd just been waiting. Leo yawned, the adrenaline finally wearing off, and slumped against Dante's side. For a heartbeat, Dante went rigid, as if unsure what to do with this small, trusting weight against his ribs. Then, slowly, carefully, he adjusted his position so Leo's head rested more comfortably against him. "How much longer?" Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 hours to the estate. He can sleep. She wanted to pull Leo away, to keep this fragile barrier between her son and the dangerous world Dante represented. But Leo was already drifting off, his breathing evening out, and she didn't have the heart to disturb him. So she sat in silence as the Mercedes cut through the storm, carrying them toward the life she'd tried so desperately to escape. The rain never let up. Alara must have dozed off, because she woke to the sound of iron gates closing behind them with the finality of a prison door. She blinked, disoriented, and looked out the window at a scene pulled from another world. The Volkov estate sprawled before them, all stone and steel and architectural precision, lit from below by discreet lighting that made it look like something carved from shadow. Tall windows glowed with warm light. Manicured gardens stretched into darkness. And everywhere she sensed the invisible presence of security, of eyes watching, of a fortress built to keep the world out, or keep someone in. "We're here," Dante said unnecessarily. Leo was still asleep against him, drooling slightly on what was probably a $5,000 suit jacket. Dante seemed utterly unconcerned, his large hand resting on Leo's back with unexpected gentleness. The car stopped beneath a covered portico. The driver opened Alara's door, and humid night air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and night-blooming jasmine. She stepped out on unsteady legs, her cheap canvas shoes sinking into gravel that was probably imported from some exotic location. Dante emerged on the other side, lifting Leo with a care that made her chest ache. The boy barely stirred, just snuggled closer to the warmth and solidity of his father's chest. Seeing them together, Leo's smallness against Dante's lethal strength, made something inside her break and heal simultaneously. "This way." Dante moved toward the entrance, and Alara had no choice but to follow. The double doors opened before them, revealing a foyer that was all polished marble and soaring ceilings, and the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. A woman in her 50s appeared, steel gray hair pulled into an elegant bun, wearing a crisp black dress that screamed head of household. Mr. Volkov. Her voice was warm but professional. The rooms are prepared. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Dante's eyes found Alara. No relation? The small comment, his acknowledgement that she might find the shared surname jarring, was so unexpected that Alara didn't know how to respond. I'll show Mrs. Chen paused, uncertain. Mrs. Volkov, Dante corrected quietly. She never changed her name. Because she hadn't. Even after the divorce, even in hiding, she'd kept his name. She told herself it was for practical reasons, that changing it would create a paper trail. But standing here now, she wondered if some part of her had always known she'd never truly escaped him. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted. Surprise, then something calculating. Of course. Mrs. Volkov, if you'll follow me? They moved through hallways that Alara half remembered, though the decor had changed. More art now, pieces that probably cost more than most people made in a lifetime. The scent of expensive leather and wood polish and something else, cedarwood cologne that marked this place as undeniably Dante's. Mrs. Chen stopped before a door on the second floor. The nursery. We prepared it based on Mr. Volkov's specifications. She opened the door and Alara's breath caught. The room was perfect. Not ostentatious, not overdone, but perfect. A child-sized bed with soft navy bedding. Shelves lined with books and toys still in their packages. A mural on one wall of a forest at twilight. Magical and slightly wild. Everything a little boy could want. Created by a father who'd only learned of his son's existence hours ago. Dante moved past her and laid Leo on the bed with the careful precision of someone handling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. He stepped back, staring down at the sleeping child, and Alara saw his hands flex at his sides as if he wanted to reach out again but didn't trust himself. He'll need pajamas, Dante said. He's wearing them. He'll need clothes, everything. Make a list. I have a list. It's called not needing anything from you. His head turned, those silver eyes locking onto her with laser focus. That defiance might have worked when you were hiding in a town I'd never heard of. It doesn't work here. Make the list, Alara, or I'll have my people buy out every children's store in the city. He would too, out of spite or thoroughness or both. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat delicately. Your room is across the hall, Mrs. Volkov. I'm staying with Leo. No. Dante's voice was flat, absolute. You're staying where I can see you. The boy is safe here, safer than he's been in 3 years. The implication was clear. She'd failed to protect Leo by running. Now Dante was taking over. She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her, and Leo was already asleep in this beautiful room that Dante had built for him. What could she say that would change anything? So she nodded and followed Mrs. Chen across the hallway. The bedroom was familiar, not identical to the one she'd shared with Dante before the divorce, but close enough that her body recognized it on some cellular level. King-sized bed with crisp white linens, sitting area by the window, ensuite bathroom visible through an open door. The scent of fresh flowers, peonies, her favorite, on the nightstand. And on the dresser, sitting on a small velvet cushion like a religious artifact, was her wedding ring. Alara's knees went weak. The ring was exactly as she remembered, platinum band with a flawless diamond that caught the light like captured starlight. Simple, elegant, devastatingly beautiful. She'd left it behind when she fled, thinking it would be easier to sever ties completely. But Dante had kept it. For 3 years, through war and blood and whatever hell he'd endured, he'd kept her ring. He never put it away, Mrs. Chen said softly from the doorway. After you left, He kept it in his office, looked at it sometimes when he thought no one was watching. Alara couldn't breathe. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you should know what it cost him to let you go." The older woman's eyes were kind but firm. "And what it will cost you if you try to leave again." She left, closing the door with a soft click, and Alara was alone with her ghosts. She moved to the dresser as if in a dream, her fingers hovering over the ring without touching it. This small circle of metal and stone represented everything: the whirlwind courtship, the wedding that had felt like a fairy tale, the gradual realization that she'd married a man capable of unfathomable darkness, and the love. God help her, the love that had nearly destroyed them both. She didn't put the ring on, but she didn't leave it behind either. Dante's office was on the 3rd floor, accessed by a private elevator that required both a key card and a fingerprint. The room was exactly as he'd designed it, all dark wood and steel, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate grounds. Security monitors lined one wall, showing various angles of the property. His desk was a massive slab of black walnut that had once belonged to a Russian oligarch who'd made the mistake of crossing the Volkov family. Dante had sent the man's fingers back to Moscow in a Tiffany box. Now he stood at those windows, staring out at the rain-soaked darkness, and felt the control he'd maintained for 3 years finally fracturing. He had a son with his eyes and Alara's delicate bone structure, and a smile that had driven straight through Dante's chest like a blade. 3 years old, 3 years of first words and first steps, and moments Dante would never get back because Alara had decided he wasn't worthy of them. His hand curled into a fist against the glass. He should be furious. He was furious. But beneath the rage was something vast and terrifying, a love so immediate and complete for this child, he barely knew that it threatened to unmake him. The moment Leo had looked up at him with those silver eyes, something fundamental had shifted in Dante's universe. Everything he'd built, every empire and alliance and carefully constructed defense, suddenly had a new purpose: protecting that boy. And Alara. Always Alara. His phone buzzed. Dante glanced at the screen and saw a message from Victor, his head of security. Just 2 words: "You'll want to see this." Dante moved to his desk and opened his laptop. The email contained a single attachment: a photograph. He clicked it, and his blood turned to ice. The image showed Alara and Leo at the diner, taken through the front window. Timestamp: 6 hours ago before Dante had arrived. The angle was deliberate, professional. Someone with resources had been watching them, watching his son. The caption below the photo was in Russian: "Interesting development. My condolences on your secret family." No signature, but Dante didn't need one. He recognized the phrasing, the particular brand of mocking courtesy. Alexei Morozov, old guard Russian mob, one of the few power players who'd survived the war with the Koslov family intact. And now he knew about Leo. Dante's mind moved with lethal precision, calculating angles and vulnerabilities, and necessary responses. Morozov sending the photo was a message: "I know your weakness. I can reach them." The fact that Alara and Leo were here now, behind Dante's security, meant Morozov's window had closed. But he'd had hours where they'd been exposed, hours where someone could have taken them. The rage that swept through Dante was biblical. He closed the laptop with careful control because the alternative was putting his fist through it. Then he pulled out his phone and made 3 calls in rapid succession. First to Victor. "Triple security on the estate. No one in or out without my personal authorization, and find out how Morozov got that photo. Someone followed me to that diner." Second, to his information broker. "Everything on Alexei Morozov, bank accounts, safe houses, family, mistresses, everything. I want to know where he sleeps and who he dreams about." Third, to Ivan, his most trusted enforcer. "Assemble the team. We're sending a message." When he ended the calls, the office was silent except for the rain against the windows. Dante stood there, feeling the old, familiar coldness settle over him, the mindset that had kept him alive through a dozen assassination attempts and a war that had painted the city red. He'd thought that part of him could stay dormant now that the major threats were eliminated. He'd thought he could bring Alara back to a cleaned-up world, a safer empire. But men like Morozov would always exist. And now that they knew about Leo, about the child who carried Dante's blood in his eyes, they would never stop coming, unless Dante made them. He left the office and moved through the darkened hallway with predatory silence. Past Leo's room, where he paused to crack the door and confirm his son was still sleeping peacefully, the stuffed elephant clutched to his chest. Past the guest rooms and the library and the countless spaces that made up this fortress he'd built, to Alara's door. It was unlocked. Of course it was. Where would she run? Here on his estate with his people surrounding her. Dante pushed it open slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. Alara was in the bed, her dark hair spread across the pillow, one hand tucked under her cheek. She'd changed into a t-shirt, one of his, he realized with dark satisfaction. Pulled from the closet, where he'd kept some of her things. She'd never been able to sleep in the clothes she'd worn during the day. Some things didn't change. He moved closer, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet, until he stood beside the bed looking down at her. In sleep, the years fell away. She looked like the woman he'd married, young and beautiful, and untouched by the violence that had driven them apart. But she wasn't untouched. He could see it in the faint shadows under her eyes, the calluses on her hands from work she should never have had to do. She'd suffered, she'd struggled, and he hadn't been there to protect her because he'd made the choice to let her go. Never again. The thought was a vow, silent but absolute. No one would take them from him. Not Morozov, not any enemy who thought Dante's family was a weakness to exploit. He would burn the world to ash before he let anyone hurt Alara or Leo. Would stack bodies like cordwood and paint the streets with blood until every person who'd ever considered them targets was dead or too terrified to breathe their names. He'd spent 3 years building an empire. Now he would wield it like a weapon. Alara stirred in her sleep, her lips parting on a soft sigh, and Dante felt something crack in his chest. He wanted to touch her, to trace the curve of her cheek and feel the warmth of her skin. Wanted to wake her up and demand answers and apologies and promises that she'd never run again. But more than that, he wanted to let her sleep, wanted to give her one night of peace before the storm he was about to unleash. So he stood there in the darkness, watching over her like a guardian or a ghost, and made his silent promises. By dawn, every man who'd touched his secret heir, every person who'd known about Leo and considered him leverage, would be begging for mercy, and Dante would show them exactly as much mercy as they'd shown when they aimed their surveillance at his son. None at all. Dawn came cold and gray, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the early hours. Dante stood in his office, watching pale light creep across the estate grounds, and felt the weight of sleeplessness pressing against his skull. He hadn't gone to bed after leaving Alara's room. Instead, he'd spent the night making calls, mobilizing resources, and planning the systematic dismantling of anyone who posed a threat to his family. His family. The words still felt foreign in his mind, sharp-edged and uncomfortable. For 3 years, he'd had nothing but his empire and his vengeance. Now he had a son who asked about dragons, and a woman who still wore his name even after running from everything it represented. The house was beginning to stir. He could hear Mrs. Chen moving through the lower floors, the soft footsteps of security personnel changing shifts, the distant sound of Leo's voice asking questions in that endless stream of consciousness way small children had. Alara's response was too quiet to make out, but he could hear the warmth in it, the patience. She'd kept that warmth away from him for 3 years. The rage that thought provoked was clean and cold, different from the heat of last night's protective fury. This was the anger of a man who'd been denied something precious, who'd spent years believing himself alone when he'd had a son growing up without him. He needed to understand why, needed to know what had driven her away beyond the surface explanation of the divorce. Dante left his office and made his way to Alara's room. He knocked once, a courtesy he hadn't extended in years, and entered without waiting for a response. She wasn't there. The bed was made with military precision, his t-shirt folded neatly on the dresser beside the wedding ring she still hadn't touched. The room smelled like her, jasmine, and something uniquely Alara that had haunted him through 3 years of empty beds. He moved to the closet, intending to verify that she hadn't somehow fled again in the night, and found her small canvas bag tucked in the corner. Everything she'd brought with her from that other life fit in one worn bag. The realization made something dark and possessive coil in his chest. He should leave it alone, should respect the boundary between them, at least until they'd had a chance to talk properly. But Dante Volkov hadn't built an empire by respecting boundaries. He pulled the bag out and opened it. A few changes of clothes for Leo, practical and worn. A picture book with a cracked spine, some toiletries, and at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag as if to protect them from water damage, a bundle of envelopes. Dante's hands stilled. The envelopes were addressed to him, care of the Volkov Industries headquarters in the city. Alara's handwriting, unmistakable. But the postmarks were wrong. These had never been mailed, and some of them had dates from 3 years ago, from right after the divorce. He should wait, should ask her about them. But his fingers were already pulling out the first letter, unfolding paper that had been handled so many times the creases were nearly worn through. Dante, I know you said not to contact you. I know the divorce was meant to be final. But I need you to know that I'm pregnant. The words hit him like a bullet. I found out 2 weeks after I signed the papers. I've been trying to find the courage to tell you, but every time I pick up the phone, I remember the way you looked at me in your office that last day. Like I was a problem you'd finally solved. Like letting me go was the easiest decision you'd ever made. I don't know what to do. Part of me thinks you deserve to know. Part of me thinks a child shouldn't grow up in your world, surrounded by violence and darkness, and the constant fear of who might use them as leverage. I'm going to send this letter. I've decided. You can do what you want with the information, but at least I'll know I told you. I still love you. That's the worst part. I still love you, even though you broke my heart to save my life. Alara Dante's hands were shaking. He set the letter down with meticulous care and reached for the next one. And the next. 7 letters in total, spanning the first few months after the divorce, each one telling him about the pregnancy, about her fear and her hope and her desperate uncertainty, about doctor's appointments and morning sickness and the moment she'd first felt the baby move, about his son, and he'd never received a single one. The calm that settled over Dante was absolute. It was the calm that came before annihilation, the eye of a hurricane that promised devastation when it passed. Someone had intercepted these letters. Someone had kept them from him, had allowed him to believe Alara had simply vanished without a word when she'd been trying to reach him all along. He knew exactly who. Dante pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. It rang 3 times before a cultured voice answered. Dante, I didn't expect to hear from you so early. Where are you? Dante's voice was soft, deadly. His father, Nikolai Volkov, semi-retired head of the family, hesitated. At the penthouse. Why? Stay there. I'm coming to see you. Is something wrong? You tell me, Father. You tell me why I'm holding 7 letters that Alara sent me 3 years ago. Letters I never received. Letters telling me I was going to be a father. The silence on the other end was answer enough. Dante, Don't. The single word cracked like a whip. Don't say a fucking word until I'm standing in front of you. And when I get there, you're going to explain why you stole 3 years of my son's life from me. And then you're going to pray I don't kill you for it. He ended the call and stood in the silence of Alara's room, holding the evidence of her attempts to reach him, feeling something fundamental break inside him. She hadn't abandoned him. She'd tried. She'd reached out again and again, and someone, his own father, had intercepted every attempt, had let Dante believe she'd chosen to keep their child a secret, had poisoned the well before they'd even had a chance. The betrayal was comprehensive, absolute, and his father would pay for it. But first, Dante needed to see Alara. He found her in Leo's room, sitting cross-legged on the floor while their son built an elaborate tower out of blocks. She'd changed into fresh clothes, jeans and a sweater that hung loose on her frame, another reminder of how hard she'd been working just to survive. Her hair was damp from a shower, falling in dark waves around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and whatever she saw in his expression made her go still. "Leo," Dante said quietly, "can you give me a moment with your mother?" "But I'm building a castle for Mr. Trumpets." "It's impressive. 5 more minutes, then Mrs. Chen has breakfast ready for you. She made pancakes." Leo's eyes lit up. "With chocolate chips?" "If you want them." The easy way Dante spoke to their son, the natural authority tempered with gentleness, made Alara's chest ache. This was what she denied Leo by running. A father who would give him chocolate chip pancakes and build him a room full of dreams. But she'd also denied him a father who came home with blood on his hands. "Okay." Leo returned to his blocks, and Dante's gaze shifted back to Alara. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. She rose on unsteady legs and followed him into the hallway, acutely aware of the breadth of his shoulders, the coiled tension in his movements. He was angry. She could see it in the rigid set of his jaw, the dangerous calm in his eyes. He led her to a sitting room at the end of the hall, all tall windows and elegant furniture, and closed the door behind them. Then he turned to face her, and the look on his face made her take an involuntary step back. "Why didn't you tell me you sent letters?" The question was so unexpected that for a moment, Alara couldn't process it. "What?" "The letters, Alara. 7 of them? Telling me about the pregnancy, about Leo? Why didn't you mention them last night when I asked why you kept my son from me?" Her blood turned to ice. "You found my bag." "Answer the question." "Because it doesn't matter. I sent them, and you never responded. That told me everything I needed to know about whether you wanted to be a father." Dante's laugh was harsh, empty. "I never received them. Not one. My father intercepted them, kept them from me." The world tilted. Alara reached out to steady herself against the back of a chair, her mind reeling. "No, that's not. Why would he do that?" "Because he never approved of you. Thought you were a weakness I couldn't afford during the war with Koslov. He probably saw your letters as an opportunity to sever the connection permanently." Dante's hands flexed at his sides, and she could see the effort it took him to maintain control. "He let me spend 3 years believing you disappeared without a word. Let me think you'd chosen to keep my son hidden out of malice or fear or hatred. And I believed it. Last night, I stood in that diner and looked at you like you'd committed the ultimate betrayal." Tears burned in Alara's eyes. "I thought you didn't want us. I thought the divorce was proof that you were done, that adding a baby to the equation would just make things worse. When you never responded to my letters, I decided to disappear completely, to give Leo a life away from all of this. And I thought you decided I wasn't worth telling." Dante moved closer, his voice dropping to that dangerous softness that always preceded violence. "We've both been played, Alara, manipulated by someone who thought he knew better than us what we needed. What are you going to do?" His smile was terrible, I'm going to visit my father, and then I'm going to make sure everyone who's ever thought about using my family as leverage understands exactly what that choice costs. She should be afraid, should recognize this as the monster emerging, the dark side of Dante that had always terrified her. But all she felt was a strange, fierce relief. Because for the first time she understood that his darkness wasn't pointed at her. It was pointed at anyone who tried to hurt her. "The photo," she said suddenly. "The one of Leo and me at the diner. Who sent it?" "Alexei Morozov. Old Russian mob. Thinks he can challenge me now that the Kozlov family is gone." Dante's eyes were mercury bright, cold with purpose. "He made a mistake. They all did. Dante, you're safe here. Leo is safe here. No one gets past my security. But I need you to understand something." He stepped closer, crowding her against the chair, his presence overwhelming. "I'm going to war, Alara. A short, brutal war. And when it's over, the city will know that touching my family means death. Do you understand?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Good." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hand. The touch was gentle, reverent, completely at odds with the violence radiating from every other part of him. "I failed you once by letting you go. I won't fail you again." Then he was gone, moving through the doorway with lethal purpose, leaving Alara alone with the realization that the storm she'd been running from for 3 years was about to make landfall. And God help anyone caught in its path. The attack came at dusk. Alara was in the library with Leo, reading him a story about a brave knight and a dragon, when the lights went out. One moment, the warm glow of lamps and the comfort of leather-bound books. The next, darkness and the sudden shrill sound of alarms. Her maternal instincts took over before conscious thought. She grabbed Leo and dropped to the floor behind the massive oak desk, pulling him tight against her chest. His small body was trembling. "Mama, what's happening?" "Shh, baby. We're playing the quiet game, remember? Like hide and seek. But we have to be very, very still." The sound of gunfire shattered the night, distant at first, then closer. Men shouting in Russian. The controlled, methodical response of Dante's security team. And underneath it all, a sound that made her blood run cold. The systematic breach of doors, of intruders moving through the house with purpose. They were coming for Leo, for her, for Dante's weakness. The library door burst, open, and Alara pressed her hand over Leo's mouth to keep him silent. Heavy footsteps, 2 men, maybe 3, sweeping the room with tactical flashlights. "Search everywhere. The woman and the kid are worth 10 million if we bring them to Morozov alive." So, this was what a price on their heads felt like. Alara's mind raced, calculating distances and possibilities. The desk was good cover, but if they searched systematically, they'd find them in minutes. The windows were too far, too exposed. She had nothing to defend herself with, except her body and her desperation. It wouldn't be enough. The flashlight beam swept closer, illuminating spines of books and the edge of the desk. Any moment now, they'd look behind it, and the lights came back on in a blinding surge, and Dante was standing in the doorway. Alara had seen him angry before, had seen him cold and controlled and terrifying in a suit. But she'd never seen this. Dante Volkov stripped down to his essential violence, covered in blood that wasn't his, holding a gun in each hand with the casual expertise of a man born to warfare. His eyes swept the room, found the 2 intruders, and went absolutely arctic. "You're in my house," he said quietly. "Threatening my family." The men spun, weapons rising, but they were too slow. Dante moved with inhuman speed and precision. The first man went down with a bullet between his eyes before his finger reached the trigger. The second managed to get off a wild shot that shattered a lamp before Dante's second bullet took him in the throat. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Leo screamed against Alara's hand, and she felt her own scream building in her chest, a primal sound of terror and relief and shock. Dante's gaze found them behind the desk. For a heartbeat, she saw something raw and desperate cross his face, the fear of almost losing them, the rage at their terror. Then the mask slammed back down, and he was moving toward them, holstering his weapons. "Are you hurt?" Alara shook her head, unable to speak. Leo was crying now, his small face buried in her shoulder. "Victor!" Dante barked into a radio she hadn't noticed. "Library clear. 2 hostiles down. How many more?" The response crackled back. 3 neutralized at the south entrance. 1 captured alive for questioning. The rest retreated when they realized they were outgunned. Morozov's men. Confirmed. Dante's jaw tightened. He crouched down in front of Alara and Leo. And despite the blood on his clothes and the fresh violence in his eyes, his hands were gentle as he reached for them. "Let me see him." Alara loosened her grip, and Leo turned his tear-stained face toward Dante. The boy was shaking, his small hands clutching Mr. Trumpet's like a lifeline. "You're okay," Dante said, his voice softer than Alara had ever heard it. "You're safe. The bad men can't hurt you now." You shot them." Leo's voice was tiny, traumatized. "I did. Because they wanted to take you and your mother away from me, and I will never let that happen." Dante's hand came up to cup the back of Leo's head, a gesture so protective and possessive that Alara felt tears sting her eyes. "Do you understand? Anyone who tries to hurt my family answers to me." Leo nodded shakily, and Dante pulled both of them into his arms, careful of the blood, sheltering them against his chest like they were the most precious things in his world. Because they were. Alara could feel it in the way he held them, in the thundering of his heart against her cheek, in the absolute certainty of his embrace. This man, this monster who'd just killed 2 people without hesitation, was the only thing standing between her son and a world that would devour them. She'd spent 3 years running from Dante's darkness. But darkness, she realized now, was exactly what they needed. Because monsters didn't fear other monsters. They feared the bigger monster, the more ruthless one. They feared Dante Volkov. "Take them to the safe room," Dante ordered, and Alara looked up to see Victor standing in the doorway, a mountain of a man with tactical gear and an assault rifle. "Full lockdown until I've secured the perimeter." "The captured hostile?" "Bring him to the garage. I'll be there shortly." Victor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition of what the garage meant. Where Dante conducted interrogations. Where people went to give up information or give up their lives, and sometimes both. Alara should protest. Should say something about the violence, about exposing Leo to this world. But her son was alive and safe in Dante's arms, and that was all that mattered. Victor stepped forward, and Dante transferred Leo to him with visible reluctance. The big man handled the boy with surprising gentleness, murmuring something in Russian that seemed to calm him. "Alara." Dante's hand cupped her face, tilting her head up until she met his eyes. "I need you to go with Victor. I need to know you're somewhere they can't touch you while I finish this." "What are you going to do?" His smile was terrible. "I'm going to find out everything Morozov's man knows, and then I'm going to end this war before dawn. By killing them all. By killing every single person who thought my family was fair game." His thumb traced her cheekbone, a tender gesture at odds with his words. "You wanted to run from this. From me. I understand why. But look around, Alara. Look at what happened when I wasn't there to protect you. The world doesn't care that you want peace. It will come for you anyway. The only question is whether you have someone willing to meet it with fire." He was right. She'd run to that small coastal town seeking safety, and within hours of Dante finding them, Trained killers had followed. Her hiding had only delayed the inevitable. "Go," Dante said softly. "Let me be the monster so you don't have to be." She nodded and let Victor lead them away, looking back once to see Dante standing in the library surrounded by bodies and blood, looking like a dark angel of vengeance. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for anyone who stood against him. The safe room was exactly what it sounded like, a reinforced bunker beneath the estate, accessed through a hidden elevator in the wine cellar. It had beds, supplies, communications equipment, and walls thick enough to withstand anything short of a nuclear blast. Alara sat on one of the beds with Leo in her lap, rocking him gently as his crying subsided into hiccuping breaths. Mrs. Chen appeared with warm milk and cookies, her expression calm despite the violence above. "Mr. Volkov has everything under control," she said quietly. "People died in our house." Alara's voice sounded hollow. Leo saw his father protect him. That's what he'll remember. The older woman's gaze was knowing, sympathetic. "You can't shelter children from every darkness, Mrs. Volkov. All you can do is show them that someone stands between them and the worst of it." Was that what Dante was doing? Standing between them and the darkness? Hours passed. Leo eventually fell asleep, exhausted by fear and adrenaline. Alara lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant vibration of activity above. Twice, Victor checked in via the intercom to confirm they were secure. It was nearly midnight when the elevator descended again, and Dante stepped out. He'd changed clothes, the blood-stained suit replaced by fresh black. His hair was damp. He'd showered, washing away the evidence of violence, but his eyes still held that cold, deadly purpose. "It's done," he said simply. Alara carefully extracted herself from Leo's grip and crossed to him. "What's done?" "The immediate threat. Morozov's men talked. I know where he's hiding, who his allies are, and exactly how deep his organization runs." Dante's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Tomorrow, I'm meeting with the coalition, the heads of every major family in the city, and I'm going to end this." "How?" "By making an example that will last a generation." His eyes held hers. "By showing them what happens when you threaten what's mine." The possessiveness in his words should have angered her. Instead, it sent heat through her veins, a dark thrill she didn't want to examine too closely. "I should have stayed hidden," she whispered. "If I'd just kept running. They would have found you eventually, and I wouldn't have been there to stop them." His other hand came up, framing her face, holding her like something precious and breakable. "This isn't your fault, Alara. This is the cost of loving a man like me. But I swear to you, I will pay it. Every drop of blood, every necessary evil. You and Leo will never have to. I don't want you to become more of a monster for us." "Too late." His smile was cold. "I became the monster the moment I saw my son's face. The moment I realized I had something worth burning the world for. There's no going back now." She knew he was right. The Dante who'd let her go 3 years ago was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. A father protecting his child, a husband reclaiming his wife, an alpha eliminating threats to his pack. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow, I give them a choice, submit or die. Most will choose submission, the ones who don't." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. "And then? And then we figure out how to be a family, how to give Leo a childhood that isn't defined by fear, how to make this work." His forehead pressed against hers, and she felt the tension in him, the barely leashed violence warring with something softer. "I don't know how to be a father. I barely know how to be a husband. But I'm going to learn. And anyone who tries to hurt you while I do will learn what real fear means." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. Alara reached up and covered his hands with hers, holding him as he held her. "Show me," she whispered. "Show me that you can be both. The monster and the man. I'll spend my life proving it." And standing there in a bunker beneath his fortress, surrounded by the evidence of his protection, Alara finally let herself believe him. The Volkov Tower dominated the city skyline, 60 floors of steel and glass, a monument to power and precision. The top floor housed the boardroom where the coalition met, where the heads of the city's underworld families gathered to negotiate territories and settle disputes. Today, it would host a reckoning. Dante arrived at dawn, moving through the building with Victor and 4 of his most trusted enforcers flanking him. Security personnel nodded as he passed. Everyone in this building answered to him, one way or another. By the time he reached the 60th floor, word of his arrival had spread through the coalition like wildfire. Good. He wanted them afraid. The boardroom was already half full when he entered. Alexei Morozov sat at the far end of the table, silver-haired and cruel-eyed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from decades of survival. Beside him were his lieutenants, and scattered around the table were representatives from the other families, Irish, Italian, Chinese, a few independents who'd carved out their own territories. 14 men in total. 14 men who controlled the city's criminal infrastructure. 14 men about to learn what happened when you made an enemy of Dante Volkov. He took his seat at the head of the table, the position of power he'd claimed through 3 years of blood and strategy, and let the silence stretch. Victor stood behind him, a silent promise of violence. The other enforcers positioned themselves around the room's perimeter. "Gentlemen," Dante said finally, "thank you for coming on such short notice." Morozov leaned back in his chair, affecting boredom. "You said it was urgent. Something about a breach of the peace?" "A breach." Dante's voice was soft, deadly. "That's one way to describe last night's attack on my home, on my family." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "I don't know what you're talking about," Morozov said, but his eyes gave him away, a flicker of calculation, of a man realizing his gambit had failed. "Don't you?" Dante nodded to Victor, who placed a tablet on the table and pressed play. The video showed a man's face, bruised and bloodied, speaking in rapid Russian. The confession was comprehensive. Morozov had ordered the hit, had hired mercenaries to breach the Volkov estate and kidnap Alara and Leo, had planned to ransom them back to Dante for both money and territory, had thought a woman and a child were acceptable targets. When the video ended, Dante looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes in turn. The coalition has operated for decades on a simple principle. Family is off limits. Wives, children, civilian relatives, they exist outside our wars. It's the one rule that keeps us from descending into total chaos. "Your woman was already outside?" Morozov interrupted. "She left you. The child was never claimed. They weren't under your protection." Dante's laugh was cold. "She was always under my protection. From the moment she married me, from the moment she carried my name, she was mine. And my son?" His voice hardened to steel. "My son has been mine since the moment he drew breath, whether I knew about him or not." He stood, and the movement had every enforcer in the room reaching for weapons. "You sent men into my home. You terrorized my child? You put a price on my family's heads and thought, what? That I'd negotiate? That I'd trade territory for their safe return?" Dante's hands were flat on the table, his body radiating lethal intent. "I'm not here to negotiate, Alexei. I'm here to show the coalition what happens to men who forget the rules." Morozov's composure cracked. "You can't touch me here. The coalition watches while I eliminate threats." Dante looked around the table again. "That's what this is, gentlemen. A demonstration. Anyone who objects can join Morozov. Anyone who stays silent acknowledges that he broke our oldest law and accepts the consequences. Silence. Heavy, absolute silence. Morozov started to rise, reaching for the gun Dante knew he carried. But Victor was faster. The big man's hand clamped down on Morozov's shoulder, forcing him back into his chair with casual, brutal strength. "Your organization," Dante said, pulling a folder from his jacket. "I have complete documentation of your operations. Bank accounts, warehouses, shipping routes, personnel, every asset you control." He slid the folder across the table. "You're going to sign it over to me, all of it. Go to hell." "I didn't care for it." Dante's smile was terrible. "But I can send you there permanently if you prefer. Or you can sign the papers, retire to whatever shithole country will take you, and live out your days knowing you failed. Your choice. You have 10 seconds. The coalition won't allow this. You can't just absorb my territory. 9. This is a hostile takeover. They'll turn on you next. 8. Morozov's eyes darted around the table, looking for allies, support, anything. But the other men sat in silence, their expressions ranging from carefully neutral to openly approving. Because Dante was right, Morozov had broken the oldest rule. And in their world, that meant death or submission. There was no third option. 7. Fuck you, Volkov. 6. Dante pulled his phone from his pocket and set it on the table. On the screen was a photograph of Morozov's daughter, a college student in Boston, oblivious to her father's world. 5. Morozov went white. "You said family was off limits." "I did. And I mean it. Which is why I'm not going to hurt her. I'm simply reminding you that I could. That I have the same information on your family that you thought you had on mine. The difference is I won't use it unless you make me." Dante's voice dropped to a whisper. 4. The old mobster's hands shook as he reached for the folder, pulled out the papers, found a pen. "This isn't over," he hissed as he signed. "It is." Dante took the papers, verified the signatures, and nodded to Victor. The enforcer's gun appeared with professional speed, pressed against the back of Morozov's skull. "Wait. I signed. I gave you everything." "You did." Dante's eyes were mercury cold. "And for that, I'm letting your daughter live. I'm letting your wife keep the house in the Hamptons. I'm being merciful." "Then what?" "But you still sent men into my home, still threatened my child, and that requires a different kind of payment." The gunshot was shockingly loud in the enclosed space. Morozov slumped forward, blood pooling on the polished table, and several of the coalition members flinched. Dante didn't. He simply straightened his cuffs and looked around at the shocked faces. "Let me be clear," he said softly. "My family is not a weakness. They are a line you do not cross. Anyone who forgets that will end up like Morozov. Anyone who respects it will find me a generous ally. Are we understood?" Around the table, heads nodded, some grudging, some eager, all of them understanding exactly what they'd just witnessed. The consolidation of power. The birth of a new order. Dante Volkov wasn't just a player in the city's underworld anymore. He was its undisputed king. "Good. This meeting is adjourned. Victor will provide you with updated territory maps reflecting the new arrangement. I expect full cooperation during the transition." He walked out of the boardroom without looking back, leaving Morozov's body as a message and a promise. The war was over, and Dante had won. The sun was setting by the time Dante returned to the estate. He'd spent the day consolidating his victory, meeting with key lieutenants, ensuring the transition of Morozov's assets happened smoothly. By tomorrow, the entire city would know what had happened, would understand that the Volkov family was untouchable. But right now, all he wanted was to see his son. He found them in the garden. Alara sitting on a blanket, while Leo chased butterflies through the flower beds, his earlier trauma forgotten in the resilience of childhood. The late afternoon light turned everything golden, soft, peaceful, everything Dante had killed to protect. Alara saw him first. She stood slowly, her eyes searching his face for blood or violence or evidence of what he'd done. But Dante had cleaned himself carefully, had locked the monster away for now. "Is it finished?" she asked. "It's finished." Relief flooded her expression, followed quickly by something more complicated. "How many?" "Just Morozov. The others fell in line once they understood the consequences of defying me." "And now?" "Now we have peace. Real peace, backed by enough fear and respect that it will last." He looked past her to Leo, who had stopped chasing butterflies and was watching them with curious eyes. "Now I get to be a father." The word still felt foreign, but less sharp than before, like something he could grow into. "Dante?" Alara stepped closer, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. "What you did today, killing him in front of everyone, that's going to have consequences." "I know, but the alternative was letting people think my family could be threatened without repercussions. I chose your safety over politics. I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over." She studied his face for a long moment, and he let her see everything. The violence, the possessiveness, the absolute certainty that he'd burn the world for her and Leo. No more hiding what he was, no more pretending to be anything other than a monster in an expensive suit. Finally she nodded. "Then we make this work. Somehow. For Leo. For all of us." Leo ran over then, holding a flower he'd picked. "Look, it's yellow like the sun." Dante crouched down, accepting the gift with a gravity that made Alara's throat tight. "It's perfect. Your mother likes yellow." "Does she?" Leo looked delighted by this. Shared knowledge. "She does. And she likes chocolate. And old movies. And when people actually listen instead of just giving orders." Dante's eyes flicked up to Alara, something almost like humor in them. She laughed despite everything. "Someone's been paying attention." "I always paid attention. I just didn't always show it well." It was as close to an apology as Dante Volkov would ever come. And somehow it was enough. They spent the evening together, dinner in the smaller dining room, not the formal one, with Leo chattering about his day and the new toys he'd discovered. Bath time, where Dante sat on the bathroom floor, looking completely out of place among the rubber ducks and bubbles. Bedtime stories, where his deep voice turned fairy tales into something epic and slightly dangerous. And then, finally, Leo was asleep, and Dante and Alara stood in the hallway outside his room, exhausted and wired, and trying to figure out what came next. "My room or yours?" Dante asked, and there was nothing suggestive in the question, just a simple acknowledgement that neither of them wanted to be alone tonight. "Yours?" Alara said. "I want to talk." They walked to the master bedroom in silence. The space was familiar and foreign at once. Alara had never actually lived in this house, but it carried echoes of their old penthouse. Same attention to detail, same austere luxury. Dante shrugged out of his jacket and tie, draping them over a chair, then moved to the windows overlooking the estate. Alara joined him, and for a moment, they just stood there watching the lights of the city in the distance. "I told you once that you were a mistake," Dante said quietly. Alara's breath caught. She remembered. It had been during one of their worst fights, right before the divorce. He'd been trying to push her away, to make her hate him enough to leave safely. "I remember." "I was wrong." He turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her dizzy. "You are not a mistake. You are my only command." "Command?" "The one thing I can't control, can't strategize, can't approach with logic or violence or any of the tools I've spent my life mastering. You command my attention, my protection, my He hesitated, the word clearly difficult. My heart, such as it is? Tears burned in Alara's eyes. Dante, I don't know how to be soft, don't know how to be the man you probably deserve. But I know how to keep you safe, how to build you a fortress and fill it with everything you need, how to eliminate anyone who threatens what we're building. His hand came up to cup her face. Let me do that. Let me be what I am, and I'll spend my life making sure you and Leo never have to be. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the traditional sense, but for a man like Dante Volkov, it was everything. Alara leaned into his touch, feeling the calluses on his palm, the barely leashed strength in his fingers. I'm not going to run again. I know because I won't let you. He smiled slightly. But also because you understand now that the world is dark, and sometimes you need darkness to fight it. I need you to fight it, she corrected. I need the monster who protects us and the man who reads bedtime stories. Both of them. You have both. You've always had both. She kissed him then, soft and tentative and tasting of promises they were both afraid to make. But Dante kissed her back with an intensity that stole her breath, one hand tangling in her hair, while the other pulled her closer, until there was no space between them. When they finally broke apart, Alara rested her forehead against his. What happens now? Now we sleep. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to be a family. And the day after that, and the day after that, until it feels normal instead of terrifying. It might always be terrifying. Then we'll be terrified together. It was the most romantic thing he'd ever said to her. They fell asleep in bed. Alara tucked against his side, Dante's arm wrapped around her like he could protect her even in sleep. And for the first time in 3 years, Alara knew that under the boss's command, she was finally home. Dante Volkov has issued his first command, but the war for his family has only just begun. If you want to see how he handles those who dare touch his heir, you must join the Empire. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your loyalty is the only thing that keeps the shadows at bay. This is the boss's command. Your next story is waiting.